Hello, anyone watching this. This is Jason Treg, and this is my presentation for the Matlab project. I made a 2D RPG game made entirely in Matlab, and I named it the corny name MATQuest. What is this game and how do you play it? MATQuest took a lot of inspiration from those Atari-esque, really old 2D top-down games, where the player is a basic green circle who goes through different rooms. The point of the game is to evade the enemies and their projectiles they throw out, and to not get hit. If you get hit, then the game will automatically end. Um, you also want to collect the key at the last room and be able to go back to the spawn with it, which the key will open up a door. A couple of functions I use that are unique that we did not go through in the curriculum. The first one is message box, which is shown to be used right here. All it does is display a pop-up box with a message that you define. So in this case, I just defined it as game over, hit by enemy, and this is the pop-up that came out. The second function I use is white background. This takes three variables, red, green, and blue, from a 1 by 3 array, and based on the numbers you put in, it's going to give a color output. So in the example I gave for this, the main use I use for this is just white background 000, which displays a black background. The third function is axis. This just sets the x and y axis, the x and y axis of your figure. So in this, I used axis limit that's just equal to 20. So your x1 and x2 is 0 to 20, and your y1 and y2 is 0 to 20. A big concept I use that we did not go through the curriculum is player collision. This is whenever the player hits a wall or an enemy hits a wall, that they won't go through it and they'll bounce off of it. This is just setting boundaries in the game. Um, it's a lot of if statements. It's took a big chunk of my code. It's over 400 lines, and we'll go through it later on. I use a total of 11 user-defined functions. The main one I made is RPG game, which contains all function calls and everything else in the game. You just call this function and the game starts. Five of the functions I made have to do with music or sounds. I just made each sound a different function to where you can call it, and it would be pretty easy to call it. I also made each room that the player goes through into their own functions to make it easier on the code in the main function. Here's a look at the file itself, and I'll show you a demonstration of the code. Alright, so now it's time to demonstrate the code. So up here is what's called main.m. All this does is call the function RPG game, and this is where your bulk of code is. So if I run this right here, the game will load up, and you start in the spawn room with the spawn music. Um, use the arrow keys for movement. If I hit a wall, you're going to hear a thud sound, and it's going to bring me back. This is the door to escape. We're going to be able to escape later. So if we go all the way to the right, we can move on to the next level into the first enemy. The first enemy mirrors the player's movement, except for the fact that it gets stuck on the x-axis of 20. If you touch the enemy, you end up with this game over, hit by enemy. So if we rerun that, we can use this wall right here to trap the enemy so we can get past. Now for the next level, this enemy just runs at you and tries to hit you. You have to get around this enemy, which I didn't do there. Let's try that again. Alright, we got this one. And we got that past this guy. So here's the boss room. I was going to add more levels, but the code turned out to be longer than I thought it would. The boss level is two enemies who throw projectiles out, like bullets. If you get hit by either the enemy or a projectile, the game would be over. So let me demonstrate this if I can get hit by a projectile. There we go. Now, to get past this stage, I wasn't too creative since this game is basically a proof of concept of you understanding the class, and I'm not that imaginative. So if we can get back there, you beat it by hitting this in the back. Now, this level isn't too hard, but I could make it harder. So I used that white background function to make those colors appear, and I used a set sound function to make that sound go over and over. So if we go up now, we can see that this is supposed to be a key. It's a yellow circle, but once you pick it up, a sound comes up, and now you're free to go back down to the spawn area. So if we do this, we'll see that the door is open on the left side, and we'll be able to go through it, and it pops up with a "you win." Alright, so now we're going to get into the code. The first thing I want to get through is the function RPG underscore game, because this is the main bulk of the code itself. So what RPG game does is handles all the initialization of different variables. It calls every other function. It handles player and enemy movement and player and enemy wall collisions slash item picking up items or interacting with items. So the first thing I want to go over is how I made the players and enemies. I created a 1x2 array for each player where player 1 1 is the player's x coordinate and player 1 2 is the player's y coordinate. I did the same for enemies and the key. So another function that I didn't use or that I didn't put in the presentation at the beginning is the figure function, and I'm using a key press function callback. So what the keyboard callback does is it allows you to use a character and interact in the figure that it makes. So the figure is the game itself. So these different cases are different codes for a key. So 32 is spacebar, 30 is up arrow, 31 is down arrow, 29 is right arrow, and 28 is left arrow. That's everything or every character that you need for this game. So what the spacebar does is it allows you to quit the game at any time, um, and the arrow keys are for player movement. So if we keep going into the code, um, so these arrow keys give the move variable a different number. So up arrow is 1, down arrow is 2, and so forth. So if we look at this switch for that variable, if it equals to 1, it moves the player up 1. And if we look at 2, it moves the player down 1. So that's how you move the player up and down using the key press function callback. We can see right here, this is where I called the spawn music function. So where so to make sure it doesn't call it infinitely, I made a little check to where it only does it once when it enters the spawn room. Here's an if statement. I could have made this a switch as well, where it determines what room the figure displays. So by changing what the variable room number is, you can go to spawn room, room 1, room 2, room 3, or room 4. This pause function is to stop every 0.01 seconds to make the game work. So now we have a switch for that room number variable, which each case is a different room. So case 0 is the spawn room. So the main bulk of what I have in each of these switches is player movement. Well, not really player movement, but not allowing the player to go through a wall, or how a player dodged from hitting an enemy, or things like that. So if we look at this, the axis limit that I set is 20. If the player goes over 20, it changes room number to 1 and changes the player x coordinate to 1. So you start on the left side of the next room. And right here we can see the code to where the player cannot go through the wall. So if the player is somehow, the wall is at y equals 16, if the player somehow gets to y equals 16 or greater, it kicks them out to y equals 15 and creates a sound using the wall hit thud function. And this is pretty similar for the rest of the cases. But another thing I want to go over is what happens whenever you hit an enemy. So how I did this is if the player's x coordinate and the player's y coordinate is equal to an enemy's x coordinate or y coordinate, it will give you the game over and quit the game. This is the same for the projectiles or bullets that the enemies have on the second to last level. I also want to go through the count and why I made it, and the bullet movement of the enemies on that second to last stage. So I just created a count since the whole function is pretty much in a while loop except for just the figure that we went through. Um, I just made a count increment itself every time it goes through the while loop, and if it goes to 50, it resets. So what I could do with this if I scroll back down is on the last increment of count, since it can't reach 50, the last one is 49, I create a new bullet coming from the enemy, from each enemy in there. So it gives it a x and y coordinate that it goes to, and the bullet movement uses a random function, or a random integer from 0 to 3. Actually 0 to 4, my bad. So if this random thing is 0, 1, 2, or 3, let's take 0 for example, it's going to move the x-axis up. And if it's 1, x-axis down, 2 is the y-axis up, and 3 is the y-axis down. So that's how the bullet movement works. So now I want to go through how a room function and a sound function works. So the sound function is actually really simple. It just creates the function where it reads an MP3 and plays the sound whenever you call it. Not much to that. For the room functions, I'm going to look over spawn room for this one. It initially plots the player and it puts a hold before it plots everything else. So what we have here is this is setting the background to black. This is setting the axis to 0 to 20 for the X and Y. And here's your wall properties. So I used the plot for this with line, I made different line segments. So for this line segment, we have x equals 2 to x equals 20, and the whole time y equals 4. That creates a line segment at y equals to 4. And I just did this for the rest of the walls in that room. Um, the, the only one that wasn't white was the door, which I made blue. And that door disappears if you grab the key in the last room. So that's the premise for every function that I made. I'm not going to go through all of them because all of the room functions are pretty similar and all the sound functions are even more similar. So that's it for my presentation. I thank y'all for watching and good luck in y'all presentations.